Hello, my name is Aisha Jenkins. I'm 46 years old, and I live in Charleston, South Carolina, a quiet, historic city in the southern United States. A while ago, my life changed radically. It all started the day my husband, Franklin, or Frank as everyone called him, died of a heart attack. It was sudden, completely unexpected. The county hospital called me to deliver the news. He had passed away alone, right after spending yet another weekend at the lake house, that place he never allowed me to visit. For years, that house was a mystery to me, a closed-off, exclusive, almost sacred space, but only for him. I remember hanging up the phone and sitting in silence, staring at the floor, as if I hadn't quite grasped what I'd just heard. I didn't cry right away. I felt more emptiness than pain. Frank was not an affectionate man, not attentive, not close. He was a man of rules, regulations, and awkward silences. Our relationship had dissolved into a cold routine full of absences. I got used to not asking questions, not offering opinions, and not getting in his way. Now, with his death, I wasn't sure if I was mourning him or mourning everything I had lost of myself. Though I shed tears at the funeral, what I truly felt deep down wasn't exactly sadness. It was more like a kind of confusion mixed with profound relief. A part of me felt guilty for not being completely devastated, for not missing a man who had made me feel invisible for over 20 years. Frank was controlling. He would pick out my clothes, comment on how I spoke, and even decide when I was allowed to visit my sisters. He always had the last word. I was merely a background figure in his carefully orchestrated life. I never held a job. He always said it wasn't necessary, that his salary was enough for both of us, but that also meant I had no independence, no say, and no voice. Every time I proposed something, he would reply with short phrases, hidden contempt lurking behind a dry smile. I faded away slowly, and now, facing his absence, I began to hear a new sound inside me. Silence. Not his silence, but mine. The silence I had kept locked away for years. And for the first time, I felt that this silence wanted to speak. Frank owned a cabin on the shores of a lake in the Lowcountry, just outside Charleston. He had inherited it from an uncle many years before he met me. From the start, he made it clear that it was his private refuge. Every weekend, he would head out there. He said he needed to disconnect, that he was going fishing with friends, that it was a man's space. "That place isn't for you," he'd repeat casually, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. He never invited me, not once in more than 2 decades of marriage. At first it bothered me. Then I accepted it. I became that wife who stayed home, prepared his clothes for Monday, and asked no questions. If I brought up the house, he'd change the subject. If I hinted at wanting to see it, he'd laugh. Over time, that place became a symbol of everything he hid from me, and without my knowing it, it also became the key to everything I had yet to discover about myself. The day he died, I knew I would eventually go there, not for him, but for me. 1 week after the burial, I sat down to go through his things. I wanted to start clearing out drawers, closing chapters, and purging the house of everything that smelled of control and the past. In a plastic folder, I found the documents for the lake house, the deed, utility bills, and maintenance payment records. Everything was still in his name, which didn't surprise me. But holding that document in my hands felt like physically holding a piece of my own confinement. For the first time, I seriously considered selling it. I didn't want to keep anything that reminded me of those solitary weekends, the silent Sunday night dinners, or the repeated excuses. That house represented too much pain. I planned to take the papers to the attorney's office and start the sale process as soon as possible, but before doing so, I felt an urgent need to see it with my own eyes. Not out of morbid curiosity, but because I needed to close that door myself. I didn't know what I would find there, but I knew I was ready to face it. I left early one Saturday morning, alone. I packed a backpack with water, a small snack, a notebook, and an old key I'd found at the bottom of his dresser drawer. I didn't know if it still worked, but I clung to it as if it were a belated invitation. The road to the house was narrow, surrounded by tall pine trees and thick silence. With every mile, my chest tightened. When I arrived, I stopped in front of the rusted iron gate and turned off the engine. My heart was pounding hard. There were no cars parked, but something felt strange. The mailbox had recent letters, the grass was freshly cut, and there were signs of frequent use on the driveway. I approached slowly, key in hand, and took a deep breath. I didn't know whether to open the gate or knock on the door. I didn't even know if I had the right to be there, but there was something inside me pushing forward. This place no longer belonged to Frank. It was a space I finally had access to, and I was going to cross that threshold. When I stepped through the main door, I froze. There were clothes hanging on the back deck, a basket of toys next to the fireplace, and the scent of cooked food floating in the air. This didn't look like a house that had been abandoned or shut up for days. Quite the opposite. It looked like an inhabited, lived-in home with its own rhythm. The floor was clean, the dining table held a vase of fresh flowers, and a small bicycle was propped up near the window. All of it completely unsettled me. My first thought was that someone had broken in and occupied it, but that made no sense. None of this suggested invasion or chaos. On the contrary, there was order, small details, life. I stood still, not daring to move forward. It was then that I heard footsteps in the hall and a woman's soft voice calling out naturally, "Frank?" I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. That voice wasn't looking for me, and suddenly I knew. This house wasn't just guarding secrets. This house was inhabited. I knocked softly, even though my heart was beating as if it might burst out of my chest. Not 5 seconds passed before the door slowly opened, and a young woman, perhaps 28 years old, appeared with a belly clearly swollen from an advanced pregnancy. Her face was lit up with surprise and suspicion, as if she couldn't understand what I was doing there. Her eyes scanned my face, my clothes, my hands, trying to find some explanation. Before she could say anything, she asked cautiously, "Who are you?" In that moment, I understood that my presence there was about to shatter something. I told her my name and then added in a firm but calm voice, "I'm Frank's wife." Her pupils dilated and her expression changed completely. She took a step back and opened the door wider, still staring at me. She silently gestured for me to come in and stepped aside. The interior of the house was even more welcoming than it looked from the outside. It breathed home, intimacy, and routine, and I walked through it like a stranger. I sat on the sofa while she settled into a chair facing me, still in shock. The woman, who introduced herself as Simone Hayes, couldn't stop looking at me with a mixture of confusion and distress. Her hands trembled slightly as she rested them on her belly, as if seeking protection from a truth she wasn't ready to hear. When I confirmed that Frank had died a week ago, she covered her mouth, and her eyes welled up with tears. She told me she thought he was away on a business trip and that he was supposed to return the next day. No one had notified her. No one had told her anything. For her, he was still alive. She began to cry silently, staring fixedly at the floor. I offered her a tissue from my purse, and after a few minutes of shared silence, she started talking. She confessed that she had been in a relationship with Frank for almost 4 years. He had told her he was single, that he traveled a lot for work, which was why he only visited on weekends. He had taken care of her and made her feel safe. I listened in silence, without reacting. Every word she spoke was a blunt blow, a parallel life, another woman, another home. And I, the invisible wife, didn't know what to tell her. I didn't want to attack her or blame her, because her pain was real, pure, and identical to mine. She too had been deceived, felt betrayed, and was utterly ruined. She looked me in the eyes and said, almost afraid, "I didn't know he was married. I never would have allowed it." And I believed her, because there was no trace of lies in her voice, only heartbreak. She then stood up with difficulty, walked over to a hallway chest, and returned with a box full of photos. She handed it to me without a word. Inside were pictures of the two of them at the beach, in restaurants, and even in the living room of this very house, embracing, smiling, like a real couple. I also found birthday cards, signed by him, handwritten notes, and small gifts. All of this constructed a history I knew nothing about. I felt a lump in my throat, but I didn't cry. I was too stunned to react. What I knew without a doubt was that this day would mark a before and after in my life, because nothing I thought I knew was true anymore. Simone told me she met Frank at a downtown coffee shop when she was working as a barista, and he came in one rainy afternoon for coffee. She said he was kind, that he couldn't stop looking at her, and that after several visits, he began flirting gently. According to her, he was charming, well-mannered, even tender. He spoke about his supposed job as a sales rep, his constant travel, and how difficult it was to maintain a relationship with his lifestyle. He never mentioned being married. He never mentioned having another life back in the city. As Simone spoke, I felt a part of me silently breaking. Every detail, every lie Frank had told so casually felt like an invisible slap. She confessed that at first they saw each other sporadically, only on some weekends, but with time, he proposed making their relationship formal. They bought furniture together, painted the house, and talked about having children. He promised her a future, a family, stability, and she believed him, just as I had years ago. The same words, the same hope. Two women, one lie sustained for years. Simone took a small box from the cabinet and showed it to me carefully. Inside were a pair of baby booties, a rattle, and a white onesie with star drawings. She said they had bought them together just a week before at a store downtown. He was excited. He spoke about the baby as if it were the only important thing in his life. He had promised to register the baby under his name, look for a larger apartment, and even mentioned marriage. It all sounded so solid, so planned, that it gave me chills. He had done it all before, with me. I watched her and saw myself reflected in her past, also pregnant, full of expectations, unaware that the very same man who promised me the sky was building a hell behind my back. Simone was broken, but she didn't yet realize the full extent of it. She still needed to understand that her story wasn't real either, that he simply recycled the same script with different women. I didn't say anything. I just pressed my lips together, looked at the floor, and swallowed, because deep down, I also felt guilty for not having suspected, for having been silent for so long, for not having left earlier. Simone turned on her cell phone and showed me recent messages from Frank. They were sweet, affectionate, discussing names for the baby and plans for when he returned from his business trip. The last one was only 3 days before his death. "Miss you both," it read, accompanied by a heart emoji. She broke down crying as she read it aloud, as if she still hoped for an explanation, an answer, something that would make this reality that had just exploded in front of her eyes make sense. I let her cry. I had no comfort to offer her. She then showed me handwritten notes, movie tickets, a small album with photos of the couple. Everything Frank had denied having with me in recent years, he had built with her. I even found an unfinished letter where he wrote that his life only made sense since he met her. I felt a mix of rage and emptiness. I didn't know whether to cry or scream, but I did neither. I just sat there, looking at the remnants of a parallel story, while inside me, everything slowly crumbled. I remained silent while Simone wept in front of me, clutching that phone as if it could bring him back. I didn't know how to console her. I, too, had spent nights crying over the same man, but for different reasons. What hurt me most wasn't the betrayal, but having lived so many years next to someone who never truly showed me who he was. I felt like my life had been a carefully constructed facade where I only played the role he assigned me. And now I was discovering that I hadn't even been the only actor in that play. We were two women deceived by the same leading man. I didn't shed a single tear in that moment. I felt empty, as if there was nothing left inside me that could break. I had cried so much in silence during the marriage that now only skin hardened by habit remained. Hearing Simone tenderly recount her memories tore me apart inside, because many of those words sounded familiar. I had heard them too, long ago, in the very same tone. It was like seeing my past reflected in her present, two stories written with the same ink of deceit. When she finally calmed down, she looked at me with still damp eyes and said, "I didn't know he was married. I swear, if I had known, I never would have been with him." Her voice trembled, but what I saw on her face wasn't guilt. It was disbelief. She too was a victim, albeit from a different angle. She apologized to me as if her ignorance had been a betrayal. I nodded in silence. There was nothing to forgive. Neither she nor I were guilty. The only one who wove this web was Frank. Simone kept repeating the same phrase. "I didn't know. I didn't know." I felt like hugging her, even though so many mixed emotions still separated us. I didn't hate her. In reality, I understood her more than I wanted to admit. We had more in common than I could have ever imagined. We had both loved the same man, believing he was ours, unaware that we shared his lies. It was a bitter, yet strangely liberating sensation, because for the first time, I stopped feeling alone in my pain. We spent hours talking, without raising our voices, without interrupting each other, just letting the words come out when they were ready. We listened to each other as if we had needed one another for years without knowing it. Neither of us was looking for fault between us, only answers, pieces of truth that could fill the gaps of the deception. Simone spoke to me about her fears, about how she didn't know what to do now that everything had collapsed. I told her about my years of silence, about the feeling of never having truly lived. It was a painful conversation, but a necessary one. When I stood up to leave, she walked me to the door. We looked at each other without speaking for a few seconds, and without planning it, we hugged. It was an awkward, brief, but sincere gesture. Two women broken by the same man finding comfort in a shared truth. I got into the car with a tight chest and my head full of thoughts. I didn't know what I was going to do next, but I was clear that I no longer wanted to drag the chains of a life that had been forced upon me. It was time to write my own. During the drive back home, I couldn't stop thinking about Simone. Her distraught face, her fragile body protecting the child of a man who had not been honest with either of us. She was alone, pregnant, without resources, with no family nearby. I didn't know much about her, but something inside me churned powerfully. I couldn't turn away and pretend she didn't exist. Frank was the one who created this situation, not her. And although it hurt, I felt a human responsibility, not to him, but to her and that child. I barely slept that night. I got up several times, looked at the ceiling, and opened old boxes looking for something that would give me comfort. I didn't find it. What I did find was a new clarity. I couldn't sit idly by while another woman paid the consequences for a lie she didn't initiate. I felt that in some way helping her was also beginning to help myself, no longer as a betrayed wife, but as a free woman, capable of making decisions for the first time without fear or permission. I was finally starting to listen to myself. The following weekend, I packed some bags with baby clothes I still had from my niece, some basic groceries, and a couple of books I thought she might like. I didn't know if Simone would receive me or if she would understand what I was trying to do, but something pushed me to return. I wanted her to know she wasn't alone, that not all the bonds in her life had to be marked by abandonment. Arriving at the lake house, I got out of the car slowly and knocked on the door, not knowing what to expect. It took her a few seconds to open. When she saw me, her eyes widened in surprise, as if she couldn't believe I was actually there. I smiled calmly and showed her the bags. I didn't say anything, neither did she. We looked at each other in silence until she stepped aside to let me in. She received me with a mix of confusion and gratitude. The house was more organized than the last time, but her gaze was still that of a lost woman. I left the bags on the table and told her she didn't have to decide anything that day. I just came to be there, and I stayed. During lunch, we spoke little, but the atmosphere was different. There was something softer between us, less tense. She asked me about my life, what my marriage had been like, and I answered without embellishment. I told her how I had learned to keep quiet to avoid confrontation, how loneliness had been my constant companion. Simone listened intently, with that silence that only those who have felt the same thing possess. I asked her if she had thought about what she would do after the baby was born. She looked down, shook her head, and said she didn't have the strength to think that far ahead. It was then that I proposed helping her find a small apartment in Charleston near my house. I told her it wasn't an obligation, that I expected nothing in return, and that I was doing it because I understood her fear and her bewilderment. At first, she didn't know what to say. She stared at me, eyes wide, as if I were speaking another language. Then she asked in a low voice, "Why would you do that for me?" And I replied with honesty, "Because you're not to blame, because I was where you are now, and because no one reached out to me when I needed it most." A week later, I found a small but cozy studio apartment in a quiet neighborhood of Charleston. It wasn't luxurious, but it had everything necessary: a bright room, a practical kitchen, and a simple bathroom. I furnished it with just the essentials, always keeping Simone's and the baby's comfort in mind. I bought some sheer curtains, a soft rug, and left a bassinet in the bedroom with diapers, blankets, and a stuffed animal that made me think of hope. When I called to tell her the apartment was ready, she was silent for several seconds. Then, her voice cracking, she said, "I don't know how to thank you for this." I helped her move with my car. It was a short trip, but loaded with emotion. She looked out the window in silence, clutching a backpack as if it were the only thing she owned. Upon arrival, she opened the studio door and walked through the space without a word. After a few minutes, she turned to me with tears in her eyes and hugged me. It was a real hug, one that needed no explanation. In that instant, I understood that without planning it, we were starting something new. Not a forced friendship, but an honest partnership between two wounded women who had decided not to stay silent anymore. It didn't take long for the first poisonous comment to arrive. It came from Brenda, Frank's sister, who called me one afternoon just to say she was ashamed of me. "You're fouling your husband's memory," she said in a cold voice, as if I were a traitor. She talked about family, about what people would say, about the impropriety of getting close to the other woman. I wasn't surprised. Brenda was always more loyal to appearances than to the truth. I replied with a simple, "Do what you need to do," and hung up without feeling guilty. This time I wasn't going to justify myself. For years I had kept silent to maintain peace, to avoid discomfort, to not bother anyone, but now I understood that silence had only damaged me. I didn't have to explain my decisions to people who never knew what I had lived through. Simone was not my enemy, my rival, or my punishment. She was the result of a lie that I had also unknowingly been part of. Helping her wasn't a provocation. It was a way of breaking the cycle. And if that bothered others, they could learn to live with it, just as I had learned to live with their judgments. After settling Simone in, I made a firm decision: to sell the lake house. I never wanted to set foot in it again. That place was full of secrets, lies, and silences that were too heavy. It no longer belonged to me emotionally, even if the deed said otherwise. I contacted a realtor, handed over the keys, and signed the documents without looking back. It was like closing a door that had been hurting me for years without my knowing it, and by closing it, I felt I could finally breathe. I didn't tell Simone anything until the sale was finalized. I didn't want her to think I was doing it for her or because of what I had discovered. I was doing it for me, because I needed to let go of that burden. When I told her, she looked at me in silence and said, "You've been braver than you know." I didn't know how to respond, but her words stuck with me. For the first time in a long time, I felt neither nostalgia nor anger, just a strange peace, as if I had finally recovered a part of myself that I thought was lost. Slowly, Simone and I began to build a bond that went beyond the circumstances that brought us together. We didn't talk every day, but we were present for each other when we were needed most. I accompanied her to several ultrasounds, helped her with insurance paperwork, and went with her to pick up a crib that a neighbor had given her. She never asked for anything, but accepted my help with that mix of gratitude and shame that I too knew well. Seeing her so young and so broken hurt me, not out of pity, but out of empathy. I had had more years to harden myself. She had not. One day I found her crying at her apartment door because she couldn't manage the weight of her grocery bags. I didn't hesitate to take her keys and carry everything up without saying a word. That gesture was like a crack that opened between us, and from then on, our relationship stopped being just occasional help and became true companionship. She would tell me her fears, and I understood them without needing her to explain. We began to talk to each other naturally, without formalities, as if somehow life had united us, not just through pain, but for a second chance. The day she went into labor, she called me at 6 o'clock in the morning. She was having consistent contractions and didn't know who else to turn to. I got dressed quickly, grabbed the bag we had packed together weeks earlier, and drove her to the hospital, my hands cold with nerves. For hours I stayed by her side, breathing with her, holding her hand, and calming her when fear overwhelmed her. I watched her break with pain and then compose herself with strength. And when the baby was finally born, I felt something I hadn't expected, a profound tenderness, as if he were part of me, too. Simone cried with emotion, and I embraced her, my heart swelling. The boy was beautiful, quiet, with wide-open eyes, as if he understood everything that was happening. She asked me to hold him, and as I did, something inside me released. He wasn't my grandson or my son, but this baby signified something new, something clean. He represented the end of a lie and the beginning of a different story. In that moment, I felt that Frank no longer held any power over me. His greatest legacy wasn't the damage. It was the life I helped bring into the world. A few weeks later, I started therapy. I didn't do it because I thought I was ill, but because I wanted to understand why I had allowed so much for so many years. Each session was like opening a sealed box inside myself. I uncovered wounds I had normalized, surrenders I disguised as maturity, and silences I had mistaken for peace. It wasn't easy to face it all, but I felt I had to if I truly wanted to rebuild myself. For the first time, I didn't want to go back to being the same person. I wanted to be me, without masks, without fear, without guilt. I began writing in a notebook things I had never dared to say out loud. I recalled moments I had erased, looks that had hurt me, and words that still weighed on me. I cried some nights, but not out of sadness, but out of release. Healing hurt, but it hurt differently. It was a clean pain without guilt. The past no longer held me with the same force. I was learning to let go of it, not to forget it, but to not let it define me anymore. One day, my therapist recommended a women's support group that met every Thursday afternoon at the downtown community center. I hesitated to go. I felt out of place, as if it wasn't for me. But curiosity won out, and I ended up walking into a room filled with women of all ages, all with something broken inside. We shared stories, silences, tears, and most importantly, understanding. There, no one judged, no one interrupted, and no one competed to have the worst wound. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I belonged. I started speaking slowly, in short sentences, measuring every word. At first, I was afraid no one would understand what I had lived through, but I soon discovered that many of them had gone through similar or worse situations. I wasn't crazy, or overreacting, or weak. I was just a woman who had survived as best she could in an environment that didn't allow her to flourish. Those afternoons became my sanctuary. I left feeling lighter, stronger, and clearer. And little by little, I began to rebuild myself from a new foundation: the truth. One afternoon, after one of those meetings, I sat on a bench to drink a coffee I had bought to go. I was tired but calm, enjoying the silence. That's when Thomas Miller, a man with a measured voice and a serene gaze, who was also leaving the center, approached me. He asked if he could sit down, and we chatted for a while about the weather, books, and how hard it was to start over. He told me he had been a widower for 3 years, that he was also in therapy, and that he still struggled to sleep at night. There was no intent to flirt, just presence. For weeks, we ran into each other on that same bench. Sometimes we talked, other times we just shared the silence. He didn't ask for my number, make any promises, or try to force his way into my life. It was his calm demeanor that made me lower my guard. I wasn't looking for anyone, but I wasn't closing the door either. Next to him, I didn't feel like I had to explain or justify myself. He listened respectfully, without trying to fix me, without judging my past. And for me, that was already good love, the kind that doesn't weigh you down. With Tom, I learned that love doesn't have to hurt to be real, that a gentle touch can heal more than 1,000 empty words, and that everyday respect is worth more than grand promises. He didn't try to save me, replace what I'd lost, or occupy a space that didn't belong to him. He simply stayed with patience, with tenderness, with that way of being that demands nothing. He supported me through my doubts and encouraged me to trust without pressure. And gradually I began to open my world to him, not out of need, but out of choice. There were no fireworks or grand gestures, but there were looks that said everything, shared coffees and silent walks in the park. It was a love that didn't come to fill holes, but to walk alongside me. For the first time, I wasn't afraid of losing myself in someone else. I kept going to therapy, I kept building myself, but now I did it accompanied. Tom reminded me that the past doesn't define what I deserve, and that after the chaos, there can also be calm. A calm that doesn't numb, but embraces. And that was new to me. When Tom proposed marriage, he didn't do it on one knee or with prepared speeches. It was a regular afternoon while we were raking leaves in the yard. He looked at me tenderly and said, "We could make this something more permanent if you want." I didn't answer instantly. I just smiled, because deep down, I already knew. We organized a simple ceremony in a small backyard garden, surrounded by only a few people, but all of them important. There was no loud music or expensive dresses, just truth, white flowers, and a silent promise to care for each other without causing harm. Simone and her son were there, seated in the front row as part of my new story. When I saw her with the child in her arms, I felt the circle close. This baby, born from a lie, was now growing up surrounded by affection, respect, and genuine presence. Tom took Simone's hand at the end of the ceremony and thanked her for being there. I watched him in silence, moved, knowing that not all men were like Frank. That wedding wasn't a fairy tale ending. It was a conscious beginning, without ghosts, without masks. Love didn't heal my wounds, but it helped me not to bleed alone, and that was more than enough for me. In time, we had 2 more children, a girl with a strong personality and a sweet, observant boy. Watching them grow up in an environment where love wasn't conditional on fear was my greatest accomplishment. I wasn't seeking perfection, just calm, balance, and truth. Simone remained a presence in our lives. She lived just a few blocks away, and we saw each other often. Our children played together, growing up like cousins without shared surnames, but with bonds stronger than blood. I no longer lived with that constant anxiety of needing to please or the need to justify every decision. I had learned to choose without fear. Sometimes, when I saw them running through the living room or laughing loudly in the yard, I thought about everything it had cost me to get there. It wasn't an easy road, or a quick one, or a painless one, but it was mine. Every step I took, even the clumsy ones, moved me further away from a life imposed on me and closer to a life I had chosen. I was no longer the woman who kept silent to avoid making trouble. Now I was a mother, a partner, a friend, the owner of my own story. And even though I had scars, I was no longer ashamed of them. They were the map of everything I had survived. Sometimes on quiet nights I think about Frank, not with anger or nostalgia, but with a cold distance that no longer hurts. He was part of my life, yes, but he doesn't define it. He lied to me, he lied to us, and he left a trail of pain that took years to disappear. But he also inadvertently pushed me toward a freedom I never would have imagined. Forgiving him didn't mean justifying what he did, but letting go of what I no longer wanted to carry. It was my way of breaking free from that shadow and walking toward my own light. Now I know what it is to live without fear, without a disguise, without the need to fit into someone else's mold. My house smells of fresh-baked bread, open books, and sincere laughter. I don't need grand things to feel whole, just peace. I've stopped looking for approval in the eyes of others because I learned to recognize myself in the mirror. This is me, Aisha, the woman who was invisible for years and now shines without permission. And if I've learned anything throughout this journey, it's that living is worth it, even if it hurts at first, even if it costs you, even if you have to start over from zero. Did you like my story? And which city are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. If you liked the story, you can support me by sending a super thanks so I can keep bringing more stories like this. Thank you so much for your sweet support. I'm looking forward to your comments on the story. On the screen, you can see 2 new life stories that I highly recommend. There's so much more on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story with love and respect.